Most Nazi family stories are about children dealing with inherited guilt, the shame, the silence, the generational reckoning that stretches across decades. But Hermine Braunsteiner had no children. Her only family was Russell Ryan, the American husband who sat through the longest Nazi war crimes trial in German history, watched 400 Holocaust survivors testify about his wife crushing prisoners with iron-tipped boots, and went to his grave insisting they were all lying. This isn't a story about inherited guilt. It's about what happens when documented atrocity meets unconditional love, and love refuses to see. If you're new here, subscribe for more deep dives into the figures who shaped World War II. The perfect American housewife. To understand what Russell Ryan refused to believe, you first have to understand what he thought he'd found. Maspeth, Queens, in the early 1960s. A working-class neighbourhood where electricians and factory workers raised families in modest row houses. At 5211 72nd Street lived a couple the neighbours adored. Russell Ryan, a union electrician, and his wife Hermine, who worked at a local knit factory. She had a thick Austrian accent and a warm smile. She loved dogs. Whenever a neighbour walked past with a puppy, she'd stop to pet it, cooing in German. The neighbours called her one of the kindest women they knew. Russell had met her in Austria years earlier. She told him almost nothing about her past, only that the war years had been difficult, that she'd done things she wasn't proud of, that she wanted to start fresh. Russell didn't press. He was a simple man who'd found a good woman. That was enough. They lived the American dream for nearly a decade. Hermine painted their living room lilac and yellow. They had cookouts with neighbours. They attended church. To everyone who knew them, the Ryans were exactly what they appeared to be, a hard-working couple building a quiet life in Queens. But the woman Russell loved was a fabrication, and on a summer morning in 1964, that fabrication began to collapse. The doorbell that changed everything. On July 12, 1964, at 7 in the morning, a reporter named Joseph Lelyveld arrived at the Ryan home. He worked for the New York Times, and he'd received a tip from Vienna. A Nazi hunter named Simon Wiesenthal had tracked a woman to Queens, a woman known during the war as the Mayor of Majdanek. When Lelyveld knocked, Hermine answered the door in pink striped shorts and a white collarless blouse. She was holding a paint roller. The living room renovation was underway. Lelyveld asked if she was Hermine Braunsteiner, former guard at Majdanek concentration camp. Her face froze. She dropped the roller and ran into the house, screaming for her husband. In German, she sobbed, "Das ist das Ende!" This is the end. Russell came to the door. He'd been married to this woman for 6 years. He'd built a life with her. He'd slept beside her every night. And now a stranger was accusing her of being a Nazi war criminal. His response came immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. It would become the thesis of the next 35 years of his life. "My wife would not hurt a fly," he said. "She's an angel. There's no more decent person on this earth than my wife." He meant every word. He would keep meaning it through everything that followed, through the investigation, the deportation, the trial, and 400 witnesses who would tell him otherwise. The woman he actually married. Russell called her an angel, but 400 survivors called her something else entirely. They called her Die Stute von Majdanek, the Stomping Mare. The nickname came from her boots, heavy jack boots with iron tips that she used to kick prisoners in the stomach, the throat, the skull. Survivors described her beating women until they stopped moving. They described her whipping pregnant prisoners to death. They described her tearing children from their mother's arms and throwing them onto trucks bound for the gas chambers. She arrived at Ravensbrück concentration camp on August 15, 1939, just 2 weeks before Germany invaded Poland. She was 20 years old. By the time she transferred to Majdanek in October 1942, she'd been promoted. She was now overseeing selections, deciding who would work and who would die. The testimony was consistent across hundreds of witnesses. Hermine Braunsteiner didn't just follow orders. She volunteered for brutality. She seemed to enjoy it. One survivor described watching her discover a child who had been hidden by his mother during a selection. Hermine beat the boy until he whimpered, then dragged him by his hair to the trucks heading for the gas chambers. The mother screamed. Hermine kept walking. This was the woman Russell Ryan married, not the dog-loving housewife from Queens, the mayor of Majdanek. But here's the detail that makes Russell's denial even harder to understand. Hermine had already been convicted once before. In November 1949, an Austrian court found her guilty of war crimes. She served 3 years in prison before being released in April 1950. Then, in 1957, she received a partial amnesty that effectively erased her record, at least on paper. It was this clean slate that allowed her to emigrate to Canada, marry Russell, and eventually become an American citizen. Russell either didn't know about the Austrian conviction, or he knew and didn't care. Either possibility raises the same question. What did he think happened during those years she wouldn't discuss? 474 days of testimony. By the late 1960s, the evidence against Hermine had become impossible to ignore. The US government stripped her citizenship in 1971. 2 years later, on August 6, 1973, she was deported to Germany to stand trial. Russell posted $17,000 in bond. He drove her to the airport. He watched her board a Lufthansa flight while she wept. Then he went home to Queens and waited. The third Majdanek trial began on November 20, 1975, in Dusseldorf. It would last 474 days, the longest Nazi war crimes trial in German history. The prosecution assembled 100 accordion files containing 20,000 pages of evidence. 400 witnesses would testify. The trial cost 20 million German marks. Russell attended twice a week. He took time off work, flew to Germany, and sat in the gallery wearing his dark blue corduroy cap, his hair greying, watching his wife sit in the defendant's dock. Hermine's behaviour during the trial was remarkable. While survivors described her crushing skulls with iron-tipped boots, she sat knitting. She read American newspapers. She worked crossword puzzles. She seemed utterly detached from the proceedings, as though the testimony had nothing to do with her. Only occasionally did she react. When one survivor described the hidden child, the boy Hermine had beaten and dragged to his death, she pounded the table and shouted, "Diese Frau soll die Wahrheit sagen." This woman should tell the truth. She had 2 mental breakdowns during the trial. Both times proceedings were suspended while she recovered. Both times she returned to her knitting. Russell heard all of it. Every description of torture, every account of murder, every survivor who pointed at his wife and said, "That woman killed my mother, my child, my sister." He believed none of it. The mind that refused to see. The court heard 400 witnesses. The prosecution presented 20,000 pages of evidence, but none of it penetrated Russell Ryan's alternate reality. How does a mind protect itself from unacceptable truth? Russell didn't just ignore the evidence, he actively rewrote it. He told reporters his wife had been forced to serve as a guard. He claimed she was wrongly convicted. He insisted that 400 Holocaust survivors had coordinated their lies to frame an innocent woman. This wasn't simple denial. Simple denial is saying, "I don't want to think about it." Russell's position required something far more elaborate. It required him to construct an entirely fictional version of history and defend it against overwhelming counter-evidence for decades. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, the tendency to process information in ways that support conclusions we've already reached. But even motivated reasoning has limits. Most people, confronted with enough contradictory evidence, eventually adjust their beliefs. Russell never adjusted. The trial lasted nearly 6 years. The verdict came on June 30th, 1981. Of the 9 defendants, Hermine was the only one sentenced to life imprisonment. The others received 3 to 12 years. The court found that her crimes were uniquely severe, that she had demonstrated particular cruelty, particular enthusiasm for violence. Russell's response was not acceptance, it was deeper commitment. In her final statement to the court, Hermine said, "I carry guilt, but I am no murderer. Only I and God know this is the truth." Russell chose to believe her. He would keep believing her for the rest of his life. 20 years of waiting. For 2 decades after the verdict, Russell maintained his vigil. He visited Hermine regularly at Mülheimer Women's Prison and later at the Freudenberg Justice Hospital. He collected signatures from their old neighbours in Queens, trying to build evidence of her good character. He told anyone who would listen that Germany had stolen his wife. Meanwhile, Hermine deteriorated. She had untreated diabetes that eventually required the amputation of her left leg below the knee. She sewed stuffed animals for pocket money. She exercised alone. She was kept isolated from other inmates. Whether for her protection or theirs, the records don't say. The man who'd watched 400 survivors testify spent 20 years maintaining that every single one of them had lied. There's something almost heroic about that kind of commitment, if you don't think about what it required him to ignore. Russell Ryan loved his wife more than he loved the truth. He loved her more than he loved the memory of the dead. He loved her more than his own sanity. Whether that's devotion or delusion depends entirely on what you believe love is supposed to be. The wheelchair in the marketplace. In April 1996, German authorities released Hermine on medical grounds. She was 76 years old, severely diabetic, missing a leg. State Minister Johannes Rau granted the pardon despite objections from prosecutors. Dieter Ambach, who had helped convict her, said he could not support the release. The victims still suffer psychologically, he said. But the law saw a dying old woman who posed no threat. She was released to the care of her husband. Russell brought her home, not to Queens, but to a 65 square metre apartment in Bochum, Linden, Germany. A state-subsidised unit in an evangelical nursing home complex. After 35 years of fighting, this was their reward. A small apartment, a government subsidy, and whatever time they had left. 6 months later, in December 1996, a German journalist found them. The image he captured has stayed with me ever since. Russell was pushing his wife across a wet marketplace in a wheelchair. She was legless, arthritic, draped in a pale blue terrycloth bathrobe and a green-red plaid blanket. Her white hair was flattened against her head. Her hands were folded in her lap. He would stop at vendor stalls and ask which flowers she'd like. She never responded. He'd hold up a blue pair of pants, showing her, consulting her preferences. She stared straight ahead, silent. The vendors called out greetings to Herr Ryan. They knew him. He came every week, methodically selecting groceries, always asking his wife's opinion first, always deciding alone when she offered no answer. After decades of insisting on her humanity, of telling the world she was an angel, a victim, an innocent woman wrongly accused, Russell Ryan was now caring for someone who could no longer confirm or deny anything. The woman he'd defended no longer existed in any meaningful sense. She was a body in a wheelchair, staring at nothing. He'd given her insulin injections every day. He never left her alone for more than an hour. A volunteer caregiver who'd worked with them for 12 years said she'd never seen anyone more devoted. All those years of defence, all those years of denial. And this was what it had purchased. The privilege of pushing a silent woman through a German marketplace, asking her questions she would never answer. The question that can't be answered. Did Russell Ryan ever accept the truth? Everything we know suggests he didn't. In their final years together, he still called her a victim of German justice. "Germany has taken my wife from me," he would say, as though she'd been kidnapped rather than convicted by a court that heard 400 witnesses. Hermine died on April 19, 1999, at 79 years old in the Bochum Linden nursing home. Russell survived her and continued to maintain her innocence until his own death. They had no children, no one to carry the guilt, the shame, or the questions forward. Hermine was the youngest of 7 siblings, but her 6 brothers and sisters vanished from the historical record entirely. Whatever happened to them, they left no trace. The family of Hermine Braunsteiner was, in the end, just one man. A man who chose to believe a fiction, and who may have carried that fiction to his own grave. The question isn't whether she was guilty. 400 witnesses answered that. The evidence answered that. The court that convicted her answered that. The question is what it means that someone could love her anyway, and what that love required him to unsee. Judge Günther Bogen, who presided over part of the trial, said something in 1996 that I can't stop thinking about. I will not come to terms with its verdict for the rest of my life. He was talking about the difficulty of judgment, the weight of sentencing a human being to life in prison, even for monstrous crimes. But I think Russell Ryan carried something heavier. Not the weight of judgment, but the weight of refusing it. The weight of looking at documented evil and choosing to see an angel instead. Maybe that's what love does to some people. Maybe it blinds them so completely that 400 witnesses become liars, 20,000 pages of evidence become conspiracy, and a woman who crushed children's skulls becomes a victim. Or maybe Russell Ryan knew the truth all along and simply couldn't bear it. Maybe the fiction was all that kept him alive. We'll never know. He took the answer with him. All that remains is the image of an old man pushing a wheelchair through a wet German marketplace, asking his silent wife which flowers she'd like today. Thanks for watching. If you found this video compelling, check out our other deep dives into the figures who shaped World War II. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.